in that unification, it actually provides the like unified economic grounds for the bourgeois to actually like ascend to their power. So there's this dialectical reversal where in them trying to secure their power against the other classes in the states, there is this kind of it creates the unified economic territory that is actually necessary for the ascendancy of the bourgeoisie, which I think is fun. Yeah.
It also, Bauer makes like an even bigger jump and like or even bigger claim that says that like that princely centralization also then revitalizes national movements that have been dead for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He goes on 168. He says the German domination in Bohemia dug its own grave. Every advance made by the German bourgeoisie, the blooming of its commerce and mining, represented an expansion of commodity production, which is what you were saying. And then in Bohemia, the transition from a purely agricultural economy to one based on commodity production gave rise to the same immense revolution in thought as it did in other lands like France.
I want to slightly step back a little bit to the end of the last page and the beginning of of 168. It's the same basic point, but it's just I feel like this helps flesh it out a little bit. He says that the struggle between the state and the estates also seized upon the religious oppositions that dominated the age of the Reformation. The Habsburgs had decided, not without procrastination, for Catholicism. They did not want, of course, to do without the power and prestige that flowed to the Roman Empire from its patronage of the Roman Church. The estates seized upon every change to true traditional values that the expansion of commodity production brings about everywhere. The gospel became an instrument of struggle of the estates against the state. Still more important, however, was the fact that the struggle of the estates in the wealthiest and most highly developed land under the Habsburgs, Bohemia, which was at the same time the land occupied by the most powerful estates, took on the form of a national struggle. So it's like there's this economic logic that's operative, and then as it becomes as the estates become capable of conceiving of themselves as independent, then they look around for things which would make them independent. And so that's the reason for why the Reformation happens in places which are patchwork kingdoms, like in the German lands and in the Austrian lands, whereas the Reformation outside of England, which is a national struggle, it just doesn't happen. There's no Spanish Reformation, there's no French Reformation, because those states were already established. They're already coherent and powerful enough. Whereas in Germany and in Austria and in the Czech lands and so on, the Reformation is part of why there is such a thing as a national struggle in the first place.
Well, and is that why, I don't know, in France you have like the Jansenists who basically take a lot of the Reformationist points but stay within the Catholic Church? Yeah. Like they're basically double predestinationists who stayed within the Catholic Church. Like I only know that because of Pascal. Like that Pascal is a Jansenist.
France is a pretty good example of the way in which if the institution is solid enough, then reforms can happen internally. And if the way that the French Reformation happens inside the church is, I think, what someone like Gorbachev might have hoped for the Reformation inside the Soviet Union, inside the Communist Party. And of course, it didn't happen that way, of course. But that's the idea. I mean, that was the idea of the Reformation anyways. Martin Luther never wanted originally to start his own church.
Well, but I think that totally ties into your point, is you have these estates who are like trying to look for something that gives them. So all of a sudden, this thing that was just trying to reform, within the church becomes a tool of like actual like revolt.
Yeah. One day I want to do if and when we finish this book, I want to do something about specifically the Hussite tradition, because of the radical edge of the Reformation in both in the Czech lands with the Hussites and also in the German lands. What's his name? Thomas Müntzer, that Engels writes about in the Peasant War in Germany, because I think that's an extremely interesting and overlooked part of history. I mean, overlooked by Marxists today. I was scrubbing my mind for something other than saying Marxist, but that's the best word I could come up with. So, Marxists.
I was just saying that Munster is a very interesting figure. I read War of the Poor, which is a sort of like, it's very small. You could probably read it in like 2 hours or less in like a single sitting. But it's like a semi-fictionalized historical book. Basically, like yeah, Munster was a sort of religious figure who like basically led a sort of peasants' revolt against the leaders of I want to say the German lands at that time.
Mm.
It's just a shame because he wasn't as good of a military commander as he was a preacher, as far as I've been made aware of his sort of history. It's also interesting that you mentioned that, Jason, because underneath that part in the latter half of the paragraph, after the paragraph that you read, they mentioned that Bohemia experienced its reformation during the Hussite Wars, that the Germans in the land were pushed back, and Bohemia now experienced an epoch of purely national culture. However, in regard to the ideology of the nation, the fact that the revolution necessarily took the form of a national struggle against Germanness remained a decisive influence. And this is what helped Bohemia apparently like transition from a purely agricultural economy to one based on commodity production, which gave rise to the same immense revolution in thought as it did in other lands.
I'm currently just I've just found the book actually what I've been trying to find this entire time because the fight between the state and the estates is just so similar to what was happening literally a century and a half later in Spain, in Catalonia, in that the estates in Catalonia had, like, I brought this up earlier, had like huge textile, and there was a huge movement to centralize state power and also to promote free trade, capitalist commodity production, etc. And that ended up winning out the same way it did here. But that grasping, that the estate, I'm losing my train of thought, but the estates, it's very similar. You should read Britain's Informal Empire in Spain, 1830 to 1950 by Nick Sharman.
I might even write that down.
It's fantastic.
Dude, type that in the chat.
Episode.
Yeah, I got you.
We'll see if I don't write it down, then I won't remember. If I just copy and paste it, basically I take it out of my brain immediately.
That's yeah.
No, I mean, there is something about like physically writing something that does, I feel like, I don't know, encode it more effectively.
I think we have studies that say that that's true.
No, yeah. It is true.
Yeah. Anyways, back to the text. Aurelia, you brought up like how that resurgence of national spirit and nationness also like lended itself towards like capitalist commodity production. And I feel like the on page 170, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but he says around the middle of the 17th century, according to Becher and Hornig, Prague had 1,245 artisans. In 1674, they only had 355. However, he keeps going forward and says, this is a big jump. This is my bad. I'm jumping ahead more than I thought. Never mind. That's the next section.
I do think that it's probably okay if we skip ahead to this page because the
Perfect.
Previous page is just a detailed discourse of the rising Czech national sentiment, which I think he makes the case for how and why it happened. And I would, if to belabor the point, it would only be I'm not so chauvinist as to make everyone. It's like, well, we have to talk about the details of the Czech rising national sentiment. It's like, I guess we kind of get it. We can move on.
Yeah, and also just this is another great example of Bauer, like putting in the work and like being a little bit repetitive, but also being abundantly clear about what he's saying, and then ending that section with the year 1620 represented for Czechs, with the year 820 represented for the Wends. 8 centuries after the Slovenes, the Czechs too became a non-historical nation after the complete centralization of the state and the destruction of their bourgeoisie.
Because there's this kind of breathing. It's like it expands and it contracts. Because that in the same way, the contraction is also pretty detailed. But it's probably okay if we just skip through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing that I would add in order to, I guess, cover it is the devastation of the 30 Years' War, which impacted just all of Europe. Just millions of people died, which is what like basically brought this burgeoning commodity production of the Czechs back down to like nil.
Well, right, and that's why we can speak of the destruction of their bourgeoisie. It's not like the physical, like every individual Czech bourgeois is gone. It's that they have no basis for remaining bourgeoisie because their commodity production is scattered to the winds.
It's not just a proletarianizing effect. It's a peasant-ifying effect almost.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess that might be what happens when your like entire and needed reserve army of labor just vanishes in a war.
Yeah.
Yep.
I also just like the next thing he says. The nation was excluded above all from the political sphere, from the conscious work of shaping the state.
Hmm.
Certainly, the foreign heirs of the ousted Czech nobility soon forgot their origins and showed little thanks to the Habsburgs, to whom they owed their land and power. However, the intrigues and quarrels of the nobility had nothing in common with national struggles. So it's not just like it's gone for a time; it's like it's over for like centuries. That devastation is so complete that it's like it's not even acknowledged. It's not even thought of by successive ruling classes for a while.
Yeah. I basically, like in my notes, I labeled this paragraph the consequences of dehistoricization, because he just like the rest of the paragraph is basically just like what are the ramifications of basically like the Czech culture just vanishing from the Austrian like edifices. It just vanishes like overnight basically. Of course it wasn't overnight. It was over a period of, you know,
Centuries, but yeah.
yeah.
However, estate consultations became a farce without any real content. The power of the new Bohemian nobility no longer rested on these consultations, but on its position in the state administrative apparatus and in the army. No longer on the struggle against the state, but on its position as an organ of the state. That's a critical pivot point, I think.
He also goes on to say that it was the victory of the state over the estates that Austria became a state. However, the defeat of the estates at the same time condemned the Czech nation to the role of a non-historical nation. Austria thus became a German state. Peasants constituted the mass of the non-German population of Bohemia and the hereditary lands. The peasants, however, were not directly subject to the authority of the state. Rather, they were mediatized, is what he says. So there's not even a, again, like what you said earlier, like it's gone. There's not Czech language that's being used in the administrative apparatus. There aren't Czech bureaucrats because there's no reason to.
Yeah, page 171 and 172 are just very sad descriptions of the dwindling and the diminishing and the absence of a Czech literary and cultural life because of that disconnection. In Bohemia, especially this part, in Bohemia, books were collected throughout the land and destroyed as a result of Czech literatures being deemed heretical in the wake of the Hussite Wars.
Hmm.
Just because I'm a Catholic doesn't mean I think everything the Catholic Church has ever done was good.
Hmm.
True, yeah. Oh,
This
go ahead.
hunting down of books continued into the 18th century. That's all. Just it's not
Fair
an
enough.
event. It's a whole mode of existence for centuries. It's wild, you know.
Yeah. I do like how it's basically just the opposite. Whenever like the Czech nation is finally like coming back into its own, I want to say in like the 19th century he says.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
where like they start taking books about like Czech culture that were written in German and then putting them back into Czech and then
Yeah.
proliferating them. And so basically trying to reverse the processes that were happening in like the 18th and before times.
I mean, this is what
Yeah,
happened
it's
in.
it's almost like you can't just kill an idea because the idea is rooted in and based upon something which is happening in the material world. It is a direct outgrowth of experience that people exist within, regardless of what they think. Eventually, the ideas will come back in some form.
Well,
That like
and like I think there's something about like the very like the explicit attempt to negate it like actually sort of like legitimates it. Like I'm
Yes.
kind of this is way pretty off topic, but I want to read more about like specifically Catholic, but like or maybe Christian in general, like heresiology and like how like certain like I don't know, like religious, deviations are like understood mostly through these people who are condemning them as heresies. Specifically, I don't know, lots of like Gnostic and those sorts of like movements. I just find that to be an interesting dynamic in how ideas end up living even through their like negation and like the people who like yeah the material once again even though the Czechs became non-historical for this period there's still this existence of the idea even like through the materials, even in this negative sense. It's not just like people stashing away, books and hiding them from the people who are burning them, but even the people who are burning them provide the materials for a revival in the future.
As Otto Bauer would say, it is the struggles everywhere of the economic classes, the transformations of the means and relations of production that determine the power and powerlessness, the death and rebirth of nations.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.